Committee will come to order. Purpose of today's hearing is to receive the initial findings from the Section 809 panel. Now, as members may remember, in the fiscal year 2016 NDAA, we created an advisory panel under, appropriately, Section 809, to review acquisition regulations and make recommendations for streamlining and improving defense acquisition process, and also to advise us on improving our defense technological advantage. We're pleased to welcome 4 of the commissioners here today to report on the interim findings of that panel. I understand that the panel was due to no fault of its own, delayed in getting started, partly because of the department. But all members have before them an interim report dated May 2017 that, in my opinion at least, does a very good job of explaining the problems and where we are. I think my favorite sentence is where the report says, "The way the Department of Defense buys what it needs to equip its warfighters is from another era." None of us can afford to have that situation continue because the era we are in is dangerous enough and it's not stopping to wait on us. We're pleased to have, as I say, 4 of the commissioners with us today. Before turning to them, I will yield to the distinguished acting ranking member, Mr. Carbajal, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any comments, but I would like, without objection, to submit ranking member Adam Smith's testimony into the record. And I have a few questions for later on.
Without objection, so ordered. Let me welcome our witnesses today. We have Ms. Deidre Lee, who's the chair of the Section 809 panel, Mr. William LaPlante, Mr. Charlie Williams Jr., Mr. Joseph Dyer. Each of them have impressive backgrounds that are helpful, I think, for this purpose. Members have more complete bios in front of them. We, again, appreciate the work y'all have done so far and the work that you will do in the months to come. Ms. Lee, we'll yield to you for any comments you'd like to make. And ma'am, if you would, and put that microphone right in front of your face. That works better. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Carbajal, thank you on behalf of the 18 commissioners for the opportunity to present the 809 panel's interim report. I will give an opening statement, and then we have the other commissioners who will answer your questions, and we will all try to answer your questions and respond to you. Since the panel's first meeting, we have heard from the men and women who work as professionals in the defense acquisition system, those who support the department and industry, including those who have yet to do business with the department, those who study the system in think tanks and academia, and those who provide leadership and oversight in Congress. We sincerely thank all of those who have offered their thoughts to us and welcome others to reach out and contribute. Through these conversations, themes have emerged, and these themes are the foundation for the panel's work going forward. We know that mission must come first. We have to value time, the system needs to be simplified, and another, probably more discussion later, we need to decriminalize the commerce. We have learned that there are barriers to entry doing business with the government. Some are small, while too many others are large, complex, and time-consuming. We have learned that there are out-of-date regulations that have served their purpose today only serve as drag on the system. We have learned that protests, or the fear of protests, makes a slow, cautious contract process. We have learned that there's a lot of flexibility in the system, and we need to be systemically confident enough to use it. We have learned that we fail to adequately distinguish between those systems that are multi-decade platforms and those that have a short technology life. And We note that the pace of innovation in America is the hare, while we wish and act as if it is the tortoise. There are too many unique policies, exceptions, thresholds, and reviews for acquisition to be timely at a fair price to the taxpayer. These complexities prevent our trusted, qualified personnel from making decisions at the appropriate level and create barriers for our access to new technologies when industry cannot even fathom how to engage. The 809 panel is working toward a system that puts trust in our professionals to do the right thing at the right time and empowers them to make appropriate risks and to be able to make an honest mistake. Oversight is important, but not to the degree that it punishes many for the acts of the few and creates more burdensome costs and expends more precious time than can ever be recovered. Some businesses, especially small businesses, hesitate to engage in commerce with the government because they fear minor, unintentional mistakes may result in criminal charges, hefty fines, and damaged reputations. For many, including some of on the cutting edge of technology, the benefits of doing business with the government are insufficient to offset the potential downside. Companies should not have to invest time and money just figuring out how to do business with the government. Wouldn't it be better if instead they could focus all of their resources on innovation, trying new technologies, establishing new thinking, and encouraging transformative ideas? We are at a critical inflection point. The geostrategic challenges the U.S. are facing are not lessening. In order to continue to ensure our technological dominance on the battlefield, we need an organization that's capable of looking past how it has always been done and how it can be done, to how it can be done. We must be agile enough to respond to rapidly evolving threats and fast enough to develop and deliver new capabilities within the arc of emerging threat. Let's design for the 22nd century in the beginning of the 21st. Reforming DoD acquisition is a most admired problem, and we are not the first to consider it. Dozens of reform efforts precede this panel, and in order to move past tweaking around the edges of the system as it exists today, we have charged ourselves with being bold, yet actionable, and you'll see those reports in our subsequent report. Our interim report illustrates the demand for change. It provides just a small example of the level of detail that will accompany our recommendations. In the supplemental, the case studies illustrated may seem minor, but as we all know, hundreds of minor combined with major changes make a difference. No recommendation is too small nor too large. Let me say that again. No recommendation is too small, and no recommendation is too bold. We look forward to continuing to engage the community and welcome thoughts and recommendations on areas of improvement. We are hearing a lot from industry, from people in the community, and we appreciate their input and are considering all those recommendations. As laid out in the written report, we are committed to recommending a system that will adapt at the speed of changing world, leverage the dynamic defense marketplace, allocate resources effectively, simplify acquisition, and enable the workforce. Our tagline is bold, simple, and effective. And we are today releasing our interim report, and as you know, it is on our website, and our team has put it on a QR code so this is how we're releasing the report, and it's available for everyone. So we present our interim report to you today, and we anticipate your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say everything you just said is consistent with and I think supportive of the emphasis that this committee has put on acquisition reform over the last 2 years, the imperative for us to act. And we've made some significant changes, as you know, but I don't think any of us believe that we have done enough or fixed the problem, and that is part of the reason this panel was created, and we look forward to your recommendations and to your final report. I might just mention that tomorrow I will introduce some further proposed changes, and I do that about a month before we mark up our bill so that everybody can comment. And I certainly invite the panel as a whole or individual members of the panel to make comments, suggestions, especially if you think we're headed in the wrong direction for the bill that I will introduce tomorrow in anticipation of further reform. Let me just start out with a question for each of you, because each of you has in the past served in the government or in either civilian, military capacity. And just for a little perspective, is it worse now than it has been in the past?
Yes, sir.
And we can't go on too long here, but just for each of you, can you describe how much worse? Can you give me a couple of sentences on why you think it's worse? I mean, you said this is an inflection point. Why is this an inflection point? What is the imperative of acting now?
So I would start by just saying, as the committee knows, that our technological superiority has been eroding. We've been all, unfortunately, watching this for the past decade, whether it's in cyber, weapons systems, air dominance, space, EW. It's just been consciously eroding right in front of us. Well, we're doing as much as we can the traditional way, the industrial way, Mr. Chairman, doing things like studying for analysis of alternatives for 3 years before we decide what to do on something. Our peer adversaries don't seem to be doing that. They're not studying things. They're fielding things. And what it seems to be happening to us is our ability to deliver things quickly to the warfighter, other than through workarounds like the MRAPs or other ways we've done it, is worse than it's ever been.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would note that in order to achieve this necessary advancement in technology is going to require a significant amount of collaboration across industry and DoD. And unfortunately, I would suggest to you that today, the trust factor across the table isn't what it used to be. And I think as a result of that, we create a tremendous amount of risk-adverse attitudes. We create a tremendous amount of oversight, and that burdens the system down such that you don't have the collaboration across the table necessary to ensure that we get to the right collaborative solution.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the question, and we commend the progress that the panel has made and your leadership, sir. But much more does need to be done. As Mr. LaPlante, Dr. LaPlante indicated, it is the erosion of dominance that worries some of us the most. And a return to dominance needs to come from high-tech, innovative, non-traditional companies that have become reluctant to do business with us, either because of the complexity or because of greener fields being found elsewhere.
Well, that's the other question I want to ask before yielding to other members. I hear anecdotal evidence. I hear directly from people who say, companies, especially small, but some big companies, who say, we've just made a business decision that it's not worth doing business with the Department of Defense anymore. Based on what y'all can tell so far, is that a real problem that we have to confront?
I'll speak to that, Mr. Chairman. I happen to be a part of a sub-team that's looking specifically at the area of barriers to entry, and we've talked to a lot of companies that are interested in doing business with the department but choose not to, companies that do business with the government but yet are challenged by the processes. And so the answer is yes, that's a huge and significant challenge. The challenge gets into very simple things like how long it takes the government to make a decision simply about whether or not it wants to proceed with the requirement. The fact that the government goes out and announces its intent, and companies put together proposal teams and things of that nature, and it takes then the government a long time to get back to them, and companies can't carry that. If that's a problem for large industry, imagine what it causes for the smaller companies who are often out there on the leading edge of technology advancements.
I would add just a small example. When I was the Air Force Assistant Secretary, we pulled the data and found out it took us 18 months to go from initial RFP to award of a sole source contract. 18 months. Now, if you remove the foreign military sales, it still is about a year. So if you're a small company, and that's even from when the final RFP drops to when you're potentially going to get the money for a sole source in a year, you know, you can just imagine how hard that is. And I know one of my other colleagues has direct experience.
Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you a story from personal experience, if I may. I retired in 2003 as the commander of the Naval Air Systems Command down in southern Maryland. I was the Navy's senior acquisition uniformed person at that time. I went to work in Boston building robots with the iRobot Corporation, first as the president of their defense unit, and later as the corporate COO and then chief strategy officer. iRobot was a company that spun out of MIT. It's exactly the kind of company that I feel we need most. Experts in autonomy, artificial intelligence, man-machine interface. But in my trips to Wall Street, representing the interest of the company, one of my analyst friends took me to lunch one day and said, "Joe, you have to get iRobot out of the defense business. It's killing your stock price." And I countered by saying, what about the importance of DARPA and the investment in leading edge technology? What about the stability that sometimes comes from the defense industry? Or what about this or what about that? What about patriotism? And his response was appreciating that the requirements for corporate officers is to attend to the interest of their investors. He says, "Joe, what is it about capitalism you don't understand?" His point, sir, was that profits are limited by weighted guidelines. It's something a maximum of around 13%. The call on data rights and intellectual property, the crown jewels of the company, these things send you away. There are just greener fields that companies like iRobot feel better represent the interest of the investors. And last year, sir, iRobot divested their defense business.
Thank you. Mr. Carbajal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the commissioners that are here today to share with us a little bit about their interim report. My question is, every administration and virtually every Secretary of Defense since World War II has embarked on an acquisition reform effort, yet we still face significant challenges. What will this panel recommend that will be different to ensure a lasting impact that you have already started identifying? Because if not, this is going to be yet another exercise, and 10 years from now, we're going to be at the same place again. So I think, despite looking at the whole system, it's really identifying those particular recommendations that are going to help take a different approach.
Excellent point, and I think that's what we're trying to say in our supplement, in our interim report, is there is an imperative, as has been discussed here. We have to be more agile, more responsive. We cannot continue in the mode that we are progressing. So the environment is right. You and the Congress are interested. Your staff has been incredibly helpful and supportive. I think that is helping us from setting that up. And then the other thing that our supplemental is what we plan to give to you that is different than so many of the other excellent reports in front of us are that level of detail. And that's why we did the supplemental, to show you that we're going to actually give you marked up language of the recommendation. Obviously, the recommendation is still yours to decide on, but we're trying to give you data-driven, actionable recommendations so you can look at those. We also have some very bold recommendations that will come out later that will impact some particular constituencies, and there'll be some hard decisions to make significant changes for us to move on and modernize this acquisition system. Bill?
I would add a different, maybe a slightly different perspective, because the question you ask is the question all of us ask when we get asked to put our precious time into another acquisition reform study. I have a different view, which is, I've changed my mind over the years. I'll give you an example. I think reform, what reform is needed at one time is different depending on the age. I'll back up to 2009 when the Weapons Acquisition Reform Act was put in place, with CERO, some people call it. That had some very good reforms in it. It required an independent cost estimate at the beginning of programs, for example. It codified how to do analysis of alternatives. And actually, one argument, if you look at the cost performance of the major weapon systems over the past 6, 7 years, I think a lot of us have seen, and the data shows, that the cost growth is actually lower than it's ever been. It did help some things. While all that was going on, the world's changing very rapidly. And I think the problem today, as I see it, and it's driven by this technology threat and the change in the technology, is the commercial world practices have moved totally beyond the industrial model that we said that the DoD uses. So I'll just give one example, software development. In DoD, we spec out a software problem, a software system, a ground control station for satellites, for example. We get the requirements honed perfectly. Then we translate them into a system spec. We issue an RFP, and then we give the award, and then we hold the contractor accountable to cost performance schedule. It's typically scheduled for 5 years, and it will take 7, and it'll go over budget. We all know that. The commercial world developing software has left that waterfall model 20 years ago. The idea that Google develops software and then deploys it is wrong. They develop software every day. Facebook drops hundreds of releases every day. The idea that you would even spec out in detail the requirements of something 5 years from now is laughed at by fast-moving commercial software developers. They say, no, you never get it right. You got to be able to go fast, go in short sprints, and if you make a mistake, and get back on track. So if you look at the way our system is set up, it's set up for the old model. And so that's an example of why we need reform now, is because the world has changed. We have to adjust to that.
Congressman, one of the things the panel is doing, I think, to gain some new insight, one of our 8 teams are looking not just at problem programs, but taking a far too unique look at programs that succeed and asking why. It's seeing if there are common themes of experience, training, approach, culture that can be applied across the DNA of other programs, and we can take a reverse look of saying this is what you should do, as opposed to perhaps a history where DoD has said primarily this is what you cannot do.
Thank you. My last question is, the interim report recommends DoD spend its resources more efficiently and effectively in all types of acquisitions, including the procurement of low-dollar goods. Does the department overpay for commercial off-the-shelf, also known as COTS items?
Yes, Congressman, I would say that the panel has not looked at and taken on the job of looking at the pricing of commercial items. So we aren't prepared to offer an opinion on whether or not commercial items are overpriced. What I think we're suggesting here is that often when we look at these reform efforts, we're simply focused on large dollar procurements. We're focused on big programs. The problem in the system often relates to all these non-complex efforts in procurement and services. When you look at the equation, 80% of the dollars are spent on 20% of the actions. But there are 80% of these actions that are really critical to the department being successful, and we have to pay attention to those just as well. In the report, we talk a lot about clearing the underbrush. And there's a whole lot of stuff in the underbrush that affects how we get work done. And so I think we're simply saying that in the area of commercial, in the area of services, across the spectrum of everything that the department acquires, we have to pay attention because each piece makes up the big picture.
We always have to remind people that services, department buys services from everything from cutting the lawn to launching our most precious national security payloads into space. Department spends probably more on services still than a major weapons acquisition program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
definitely spends more. Something like 53% of everything that's on contract is services, not weapons and equipment. Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman for doing this, and this is going to be very, very tough to get done, and I appreciate the panel working on this. And there's a lot of frustration for me, a lot of other people. And I'm a historian by trade, I guess, military by trade, and you go back and the system we have right now, I swear to God, we would have lost World War II. We do not have the luxury of waiting that long to bring new weapon systems online. I was out at Fort Irwin the past week, which is in my district. Great, perhaps one of the greatest training areas of all. And one of the days was live fire, but the first day was cybersecurity. I met with these young soldiers, and they're talking about some of the things that they were doing off the shelf. And they're making changes. Now, you remember, I'm an infantry guy. I'm just a dumb Marine, and I really am. And they're talking about space-age stuff, and they are doing it right then and there. And I'm saying, God, why can't you be in charge of the whole system? And I understand that's not feasible, and contracts and everything else. And I asked them about it, and they said, time. And they said the same thing that you said. That we don't have that luxury. The changes are made, when I was in Vietnam, they were making changes. And that was 50 years ago, and it seems like it was taking forever. Even then, some of the systems coming online were flawed, not correct, and took forever to get there. And here we are now. We don't have that luxury. I'm going to be leaving here. I'm going to have a brief on the T-14 and the T-90, the improvements in some of these systems, and it just gets so depressed. So I think this is a great first step. We've got to change this, and we've got to change it now. Whether we go back in history, whether we look at how the Israelis change, why do they change so quickly? Because they won't survive as a country if they don't. So the stakes are enormous. And if we don't get it right, then, my original reason for coming to Congress, and that was, the military and veterans, I have failed. I have failed miserably. Now, you guys and gal, you have a tremendous amount of expertise, and I appreciate what you're doing. And I'm going to be the junkyard dog just saying, we got to cut through the red tape, and we've got to get it done, and we got to get it done now. And we have no excuses anymore. So I've vented, and I appreciate the chairman. I'll drink some more coffee and go back to my office, and I yield back.
Venting appreciated. Mr. Garamendi.
I want to thank you for the panel discussion and for obviously a very, very important issue. It seems to me that there are at least, that in analyzing this acquisition, you need to put into various categories the kind of acquisitions we're talking about. We just discussed a moment ago services and then major acquisition of airplanes or whatever. With regard to the latter, I recall a hearing we had in the Naval Subcommittee 2 weeks ago in which the Littorio combat ship came up. And the fundamental argument made by the Navy and by the defense industry was, well, we got to continue to produce another 20 of these ships that serve really no good purpose and, by the way, will probably be sunk at the very first shot that'll be fired and don't have much utility, but we need to do it because we need to keep the defense base working. Now, that's a policy question that we need to address here. So you got those kinds of issues. When you get down to other issues, there are the public policy questions. I could probably mention the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and the consumption of fuel oil, or fuel, the Defense Department being the single largest consumer of petroleum products in the world. So should there be a policy question put on the Defense Department dealing with conservation or moving away from fuel to green energy technologies? How do those kind of policy issues come into play in the issue of defense acquisition strategy? Should we simply abandon these policy issues, which do seem to me provide some break on the rapidity of a contract going forward or the continuation of a previous program? How would we deal? What's your recommendation? You make recommendations here about policies that get in the way. Should some of those policies remain in the way?
That will obviously be an end decision for this body. What our plan is to look at all of these, and as we all know, individually, each one has a constituency, has a value, and probably a very good purpose. Cumulatively, they are clogging the system. So I think it's going to be a very difficult question to say, you know, what are the priorities? Our report says mission first. And we will offer up some recommendations to you all to a very challenging decision is what is that balance?
I would offer, Congressman, that the critical question here is the question of mission and the purpose of the system. And I believe if we start there, we start with mission first, that the system that the department has to use for acquisition is focused on ensuring it can accomplish its mission, and we evaluate these various policy questions along that continuum, then I think it'll allow us to have a way to think these things through. I don't think anyone's reached any conclusion as to what's good, what's bad, what's problematic, but to Mrs. Lee's point, the accumulation of these things together put extreme pressure on the system and cause many hurdles for the acquisition community to have to go through to get to that mission result.
I'll give an example of maybe one or two policies that make perfect sense from a certain aspect of public policy, but actually can maybe have a collateral impact you may not understand. One is competition, the SECA thing, which is that the assumption being that whenever you can, you do competition. Makes perfect sense and all that. To the extent that getting at what my colleague said in her opening, the fact that we're worried about protests so much during either the RFP release or the award, the bend over backwards do competition when there's an obvious quick solution ready to go by just going sole source because it gets the mission. There's a very big reluctance to do it because of, understandably, because of the pressure to do competition. So there, again, you have to say, what's better for the mission? We do have waivers in the system that allow seniors to waive and say, I'm going to do sole source for national security. My experience in recent years is they're very reluctant to use them because of the scrutiny it gets. So that's an example where you can see both sides of the argument, and it's the cumulative effect of all of these policy issues. Another one is small business. Small business is a very important thing for the country. We'll get that. But that is something that plays a big role in our deliberations as we put acquisition strategies together, because we know we're going to be looked at for our small business numbers. And so those are two examples of good, well-understood policy things, but their impact on acquisition.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Knight?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will echo Colonel Cook. I appreciate the chairman for doing this. This is long overdue, so I'm not gonna vent because I can't do what Colonel Cook did, but I'm gonna bring up a few things. So I firmly believe that the country is risk aversive, and I think that that has stifled us in many of the things that we've tried to do. The F-22, F-23 program went through a 50-month culmination to get to a first flight program. I mean, it was a perfect example of how you get to stifling America's growth. And now we have the F-22, and we've gone through a great program, even though Congress cut that short way before I was here. It is a perfect example of what we shouldn't do. The Century Series fighter system was built in the 50s, all of them in about 9 years. We put out the F-100 to the F-106 in about 9 years. How we could do that, and then we moved to the 5th generation, and it took 50 months to get to the first flight, just boggles me. But my questions are a little bit anecdotal because we all get to talk to Vietnam vets, and we all get to talk to our vets and our warriors who are in the field. I talked to some the other day who used a unmanned system that was on the ground, and they were doing it for IEDs. And I looked at the controller they were using. They were using an Xbox controller. And I said, why are you using that? And they said, it works better. It just works better. And I said, well, it's not as durable. And he said, no, it's definitely not as durable. But you know what? I went over and I bought this thing for $29. And if it breaks, I buy another one for $29. So those kinds of things, you know, how much we act with the people in the field who are actually doing the chore, I think is most important. I think that Dr. LaPlante brought up a big part, and that's maybe SBIR and STTR. If we're going to get the cutting edge, it might not be from the big companies. It will probably be from the smaller companies. And if we don't kind of push forward those types of programs like STTR and SBIR, then we might not ever see them. So, get to my questions here. Contracts across the board, and I've talked to many different companies that work either in Navy contracts or Air Force contracts or so on and so forth, and they say that the contracts are not the same. The basic contract, not the full-blown, but kind of the basic DD-214 face sheet. Is that something that we can make across the board so that when these contracts come up, and maybe not a contract like, you know, a new bomber, a new fighter or something, but these contracts that are coming out with the Navy, that it looks like the Air Force one or it looks like the Army contract so that they know how to fill this out. They might not know how to fill out sections 2 through 4 million, but they know how to fill out the face sheet.
We have certainly heard from a good number of people that the complexity is daunting, especially for small businesses. So this kind of links to the policy question and the underbrush question is we are looking, in fact, in our report at the end, there's a kind of a list of questions that we're asking ourselves and pursuing. But one of those is how do we simplify this so people aren't spending all their time figuring out how to do business with them? And as Mr. Williams said, the barriers to entry team found from, I'll let him speak on it, but some of the people said, we just cannot afford from a time standpoint to invest the time that it requires to figure out how to do business with you guys.
Right.
When someone else will pick us up just like that, and we can actually, you know, market our product or service. And so we recognize that somehow that ability to enter quickly and to simplify our process has got to be primary. And one of the questions we're asking, talk about buttons that might be hot here, is competition in the 21st century aligned with the Competition and Contracting Act? 1984, competition was way different. And yet now, how our environment works, every day you can look online and see prices change and products change and updates and technology available. Not in our system, you can't.
Mr. Congressman, I would just offer that certainly consistency has its place clearly across those smaller dollar types of acquisitions. I think what we have to think through is balancing between perfect consistency and the flexibility that you want a contracting officer to have to go out and strike the deal that's available to them on that particular day to be able to achieve mission results. So clearly, there are two sides to that question, and I think as we think this through, we have to look at what you achieve and how much you can achieve through that consistency. Because having come from the Defense Contract Management Agency, where we administer contracts across the industry, it's extremely important and valuable to us to not go from one contract issued by the Navy and another contract issued by the Air Force, and they look completely different at the same contractor. So that's important, but we also don't want to lose the opportunity to have the flexibility necessary based on the deal that's needed.
And I appreciate my time has run out. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was hoping that you'd be able to elaborate a little more on the defense industrial-based company mergers you mentioned in your report on page 10 and how those are going to affect DoD acquisitions in the future.
Well, I mean, I can say a few words. You've seen all the charts that have probably over the years that show the number of companies in defense base and how they've collapsed. We're sort of at a point now, for example, where we really have one major fighter line in the country with another one we're keeping alive every year. As a country, I mean, we sort of have one guy that builds fighters for us largely. We're trying to keep another one in. I mean, that's something to watch, right? How did we end up in that situation? Another one is vertical lift. All these places, you look and you see we're one merger or acquisition away from sort of having all our eggs, you know, that company does all our ships, that company does all our fighters, that one does all our tankers. And so even at the big prime, it's a big concern that we have. And I know it's been in the past couple of years, there's been discussion about, you know, the way that M&A is analyzed by the executive branch. They look very much more at a tactical issue. Does it directly cause you know, something today, as opposed to look 2 steps ahead and say, well, maybe this acquisition today doesn't cause a problem, but the next one combined with this one, you have only one contractor to build this. So it is something we're very concerned about, but I think, note in the report that we think this is going to continue. The pressure is going to continue.
I would only add that I think this gets back to the recognition that the entire defense industrial complex is completely different than it was. And so when we started off discussing the fact that we're dealing with a Cold War era acquisition system, that system today doesn't reflect the fact or deal with the fact that we have 70% of major programs work often is in the subcontract and the supply chain, not at the prime. Our system still thinks of it as at the prime level, and tearing those barriers down and understanding that is very important in being able to be agile in the system.
And in our report, we've dubbed that the dynamic defense marketplace to try to explain how these sands are all shifting and the work is done at different levels in a very different format.
Congressman, it's not just the companies that are merging and leaving the business. It's the lack of input of new companies coming in willing to aggressively do business with us. It ties back to this question of contracts, of policies, of fairness. In my last company, we did not have a defense business unit, and I had the opportunity to build one from a green field. We were required to do major programs of record, to have CMMI Level 3, the software management process, to have earned value management, to have AS 9100, to have all these process requirements, which I will tell you, every one of them in and of themselves made us a better company. But as our chairman, Ms. Lee says, the integral of all those together was stifling for a non-traditional company. I kept track of a company that at that point in time was doing less than $100 million a year. And the cost of laying in all those processes to do program of record business was between $35 and $40 million. You just can't afford it.
No, thank you very much. And also your report recommends that the department align its resources more carefully in this constrained budget environment that we're living in and we've all heard a lot about. And you include in your recommendation critical consideration of the department's use of contracted services. And I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more on the potential inefficiencies in the department's spending for contracted services.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point we were making earlier. First of all, recognizing the fact that, you know, dollars spent on services has gone beyond what we spend on products, and all too often we forget to think through the services process. From a budgetary perspective, what we have to think through is also aligning the budget with the services and the contracted services that are required. So as you go through a contract cycle and budgets change and ebb and flow, that doesn't line up well with the services that are needed. If contractors are not sure that they're going to have the resources or the budget to continue that contract, and they have to start thinking about how they lay people off, and as you turn around then and switch back and say, I still need that work, contractors may have let those people go. They may not be available at the time. And so we have to ensure that the budgetary processes that we use in support of services support the labor needs that the contractors have to ensure that they have the right workforce in place. It's those kinds of inefficiencies that challenge the service contracting community.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at page 24 and 25 of your report, where we speak to the mission and its interaction with some of the other social objectives that are occasionally injected into the acquisitions process. And I'm hoping that members of the panel can elaborate on the extent to which this drains away from the focus on the necessary innovations and actions that the warfighter needs to be prepared when they're downrange.
Well, I would start by saying, just telling a personal anecdote. Right before I became the assistant secretary, I spent a day with the acquisition university folks, and they were briefing the 5,000 and how acquisition works. And I said, well, what about all the stuff we had to do during the wars to go around the system to deliver counter-IED capability? You know, where we had to basically throw that system out and go around it. They said, yeah, that's because this is a peacetime system. So I think you're hitting the point, and this is the point that the panel's hitting by the mission focus. If you actually ask yourself to do the mission, and we're essentially at war, what are the things that are nice to haves, and what are the things that are essential, and are our priorities straight, including on these good to do social things. And so I think one of the reasons we're looking at this SECA that the chairman brought up is because we're looking at that foundational precept that competition is by nature good.
Is it the position of anyone on the panel that having our providers and contract partners comply with $1 coins instead of paper currency enhances the mission for the warfighter?
Sir, we selected these couple of very simple, small examples to demonstrate the underbrush. This is a sampling of what is in there. And so what happens, talking about time and labor and complexity, is every single acquisition has to look at these kind of things and say, yep, that's got to be in there. And then the contractor has to respond, okay, have I done that? Do I have a program for accepting dollar coins? Do I have a program? What kind of review is done? What kind of reporting I have to do? We specifically selected these very small examples, and then also using our supplemental are showing you exactly how we think it would have to be marked up to either eliminate the requirement for the Department of Defense or to make a decision to eliminate it government-wide. And we submit to you there are dozens, if not hundreds like this, and we're going to submit that package to you, and there's going to be some policy decisions in that.
Suffice to say, we did not select that example because we thought it was a great example of public policy.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, given the day, I think in my district I have the privilege to represent some of the most war fighters in the country in a congressional district, and I can't say I've ever interacted with any that say that their readiness is enhanced or their safety is enhanced as a consequence of a contractor utilizing $1 coins. In technology and in innovation, we see in this country so many additives and attributes that have come from small and medium-sized companies sufficiently nimble to be able to innovate and meet needs in the corporate space and in any other spaces. When we have to have such draconian compliance with these sort of bizarre social objectives that have been woven into our acquisition process, do we crowd out some of the innovation opportunities that would be created by those who maybe don't have a compliance department to write a texting while driving policy or recycled paper policy or any of these other ridiculous examples that you've cited?
We absolutely do, Congressman. That as we talk to particularly the smaller companies on the leading edge of technology, those are the challenges that they present. They don't have the capability to put together the oversight structures and compliance structures that are necessary to meet some of those requirements, and it keeps them out of the business.
And I'll just add to Admiral Dyer referred to this in his example with iRobot. The government's also really clumsy about IP, intellectual property, and small business. We don't really, and small startups. They should be scared of us.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about mission first in the acquisition process. You know, I understand sort of, you know, how do we ensure that we're acquiring the goods and services in the most cost-effective and efficient and timely manner so that our servicemen and women are ready to fight tonight, tomorrow, and in the next decade. And the focus is on, you know, really efficient and effective acquisition to meet the needs of the warfighter. I think that, you know, I mean, I would certainly argue that that's an important mission. I commend you for your focus in taking on this responsibility. We have other missions that are larger and yet related. The gentleman from California in his question talked about energy conservation. That certainly is essential for our national security. I think that small business inclusion, particularly given that small businesses often offer up and develop some of the most innovative technological solutions for our warfighters. So ensuring that that secondary public policy that you mentioned on page 24 is promoted. It may be secondary, but I hope it's not a distant second, because these are important public policies that go directly to our national security and supporting our warfighters. So my question is, and you comment on that, but also just in terms of small business inclusion, there are a number of areas where small businesses have challenges. You mentioned a few. One was knowledge of the contracting process, but there's also the lack of monitoring in agencies, including the DoD, of subcontracting plans. There's often a lack of access by small businesses to contracting officials. There's contract bundling that often is an obstacle to small businesses, and a number of others. Could you comment on what specifically you're looking at and what you may be anticipating in terms of recommendations to increase small business inclusion in the DoD acquisition process?
Yes, sir. We certainly have heard from a good number of small businesses and have invited them and will continue to do so, and in fact are going to meet with the SBA on some issues. But what we have heard is time and simplicity, that we are torturous in our process. And for these small companies, they just cannot hang on that long and spend time and effort and money and dollars and lose other opportunities. So one of the things that certainly is going to benefit small businesses is more respect for time. The other thing is the simplicity. Not that they're not sophisticated, because they absolutely are, but having to hire a whole staff just to execute things that really don't deliver the mission is not efficient for them. It is very difficult for them. And actually their competitors, larger businesses, can do that. So it probably puts them at a disadvantage. So we think those are at least two things that are going to significantly help small businesses. We are looking at SBIR, STTR. We are also looking at possibly some opportunities where small businesses would have some technology opportunities unique to the department. And I know that the others may want to comment on that.
Yes, Congressman, I think what's really critical here is to think about how we can better utilize small businesses to achieve that mission, connecting them to the mission in terms of technology needs and advancements in the department's warfighting capabilities. So that's one of the things that we're really focused on, not just awarding dollars for dollars' sake, but ensuring that we connect small businesses to the mission. We're paying attention, as Ms. Lee said, to the SBIR program, STTR program. We're very focused on ensuring that small businesses have access, that they know how to get in, that they know who to communicate, that they understand and can get to understanding those requirements that are coming down the line. They tell us that they just struggle connecting the dot between what they offer and the Department of Defense, and so we're looking at very closely.
Just a quick follow-up, I apologize, but how about on contract bundling? Or have you seen anything there? Is any comments you have on whether we need to further unbundle contracts?
I haven't specifically seen any comments on that, and we haven't looked at it yet, but that doesn't mean that we won't.
And I just want to add on to my colleague here. The report actually points out, that, Congressman, a point you made about the connection that small business and technology is not a nice-to-have policy, but it actually, done right, is essential for our technological superiority. We can't be technically superior unless we tap into those folks. So that's an example of something where the policy itself can be very much aligned with what we're trying to do.
Congressman, just a comment on SBIRs. Many companies in Boston and Rockville around the country have gotten their start on SBIRs. I look at it as the government's venture fund. And one of the interesting pieces of that, we're willing to accept failure in the SBIR arena. Companies can stretch far, reach for a brass ring. If they don't make it, they still profit and they still get up and try again. That's a facet we don't really have in a lot of the rest of our acquisition business.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hunter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. I guess two questions. One, talk to us a little bit about putting somebody in charge of anything. It seems what we've done in Congress is said because people screw up, which people do, including us and everybody, we're going to take the personal responsibility element out of acquisition and create so many steps and milestones so that no one has to take responsibility for anything, as opposed to saying this guy with his PhD is great on space robots. We're going to put him in charge of putting us ahead of our peer competitors in space robots, or any other example on those high-end weapon systems. Talk about putting just somebody in charge, because that's, in the past 50 years, that's one way that we've done a lot of our great stuff, is by putting one person in charge and saying, you just do it, and you can fail and try again and fail and try again, but we're going to put it on you to get it right.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really clear that comes up all the time is we say we have a program manager, PEO, SAE, chain of command, but certainly there are so many people and forces that can influence things that are not in that chain of command that don't have any accountability. As my old colleague, when I was in the Pentagon, Heidi Shue, my former colleague, used to say as his acquisition executive for the Army, in industry, the program manager is the bus driver to get from A to B, and everybody on the bus is to help get them from A to B, whether human resources, engineering, contracting. When the bus goes in the ditch, everybody gets out and puts the bus back on the road because it's everybody who's in it. In the DoD, those people all in the back of the bus have their own steering wheel, their own brake. They don't have an accelerator, and when the bus goes in the ditch, the SWAT team comes and shoots out the windows and kneecaps the bus driver. Why? Because there's money to take it. So this idea of putting people in charge and holding them accountable, and more importantly, people who are not accountable should not be interfering, is very, very important to what it has to be done.
What specific recommendations are you going to have? Specific recommendations, and how many layers can you cut out of the process in DoD if you put somebody in charge of, let's say, big systems, big programs?
We're certainly looking at that as far as what is causing this, and we have seen in some cases that it appears to be functional authorities that perhaps are not appropriately placed, and that's where I think one of our teams, what does go right, is going to see some of the things of how that interaction is successful.
Congressman Hunter, your comment about someone in charge, I think, links back to the question earlier of, is it harder now or easier? It's harder, and the erosion of authority, power, by the program manager, it is perhaps a most important part of the equation.
Okay. The second question I have here with the last 2 minutes, a lot of these issues arise in the military. For instance, the Army pistol, which you guys talk about, but that you know, what a joke. 10 years just to put out your requirements for a handgun is just stupid. The distributed common ground system, billions and billions of dollars when they could have used commercial sources to do a lot of that. Those are both Army programs. We're not going to pick on the Army, but those are the Army acquisition program, and I'm sure the other services too, is what I'd like to term a self-licking ice cream cone. They exist to write things for themselves so they can do more things for themselves, to do more things for themselves ad nauseum. That happens in DoD too, but the Army pistol issue was not a DoD acquisition issue, it was an Army issue. The distributed common ground system was not a DoD issue, it was an Army issue. Are you guys going to make recommendations on the services, and are you going to be service-centric, or meaning are you going to say, here's problems with the Air Force, here's problems with the Army, Navy? Marine Corps just buys other people's stuff, so that's different for the most part. But are you going to make those recommendations too?
Our focus is certainly on acquisition, So as they impact that, but we are not at this point doing a restructuring look at the department. I think, in fact, that this committee has submitted some direction to the department to make some changes themselves. So what we're looking at is where that would touch and impact acquisition in our charter.
Okay. All right. Thank you all very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I do thank you for this hearing. It's unfortunate that I don't believe people really recognize the significance of our acquisition process. I've always felt that the problem with how we operate, especially in recent years, is that we actually set the policy through acquisition, and that it is very unfortunate because our acquisition is so delayed. That's why in your report, I'm beginning on page 2, when you recount, and in the last 50 years, there's been more than 100 reports, studies on how DOD acquires goods and services. And then you do say, and you quote a 1986 Packard report that talks about a common sense approach. But you know, these things have been around for a very long time, and we haven't moved forward. We mentioned SBIR. It was this body, by the way, and I was privileged to sit on a panel which looked at, quote, the difficulties in doing business with the defense industry, and it was from a small business perspective. And one of the issues that was raised there was the SBIR was not authorized, and it was through the NDAA that it got reauthorized, and I think it's up pretty soon. We look at what Mr. Dyer talks about, which I've always been a fan of DARPA, but it all comes back to one area. As you look at this and you look forward, how are you going to interface the FAR, which is really the governing document for everyone, and what we need, I believe, in terms of the flexibility of addressing the policy that we're going to set for the defense industry through acquisition? How are you going to do that unless you are potentially looking at an exemption from many of the provisions of the FAR and developing a whole acquisition process that is relevant to the defense industry in order to give it the flexibility that we talk about? Ms. Lee.
We've certainly looked at that. In fact, our listing of teams in the report, we have a team that's called Reg to Statute Baseline. So we have a team of people that are actually going through, and it is a torturous meeting, anyone is welcome to attend, where they go through the FAR section by section and trace it back to the origin. We found some very interesting things, some things that are in the 1947 vintage, et cetera, that remain in the regulation. And for each section, they're making recommendations on what can be eliminated, streamlined, and in some cases, those policies, to your point exactly, they're writing on how we spend money in the acquisition system, but probably, if they're that important a policy, can be accomplished another way, not necessarily in this system. So we're working through that, and that will be part of our report, is this plethora of activities that are, in fact, influencing the way people do business.
But if you don't wipe it out almost, I'm not advocating for it, I'm just saying that if you don't wipe it out, so people doing business with the defense industry can go to one set of guidelines that has a preemptive power over others, you are going to have, I think what Mr. LaPlante was talking about, this whole problem with small business, or was it Mr. Williams, small business trying to figure this out. And they have such a difficulty doing that. It's not only the acquisition, it is the compliance part of it later. That's also very difficult. So my problem in listening to how we're going to change the acquisition process is the whole gamut. And what I want to hear, in that you've only got another year to do this, is how radical a change does this body need to expect? Because if you give us something in a year that is extremely radical, we're not gonna be able to make the change. I love the concept of being able to do this in a DARPA type of format. I think that would be absolutely the greatest things we can do. But the only way we get there is if you actually propose that we may have to eliminate or preempt the whole acquisition process that's defense-related from the rest of FAR.
That has certainly been discussed. We've actually had some people recommend starting from fresh baseline. What that does bring is some complexities because, as you know, the FAR applies government-wide. So that would be, now you're a company that wants to do business with DOD, but now there's new rules for both. So we've certainly looked at that, and we've had some recommendations. We have some possibilities on how to give you some information in a more regular intervals, and I do think there will be some very difficult decisions to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My time is up. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I dig into that a little bit more, a related topic? Excuse me. I want to thank you all for your work and joining us here today. I was especially impressed by the urgency of your conclusion. You wrote, "The time for superficial conversation and insubstantial changes to regulations and statutes has passed. The Section 809 panel has no interest in putting patches on a broken system. We intend to take a big bite into real change rather than just nibble around the edges. To do otherwise is to put our military's mission and our nation's safety and security at risk." I couldn't agree more, and I applaud you for saying it in such clear language, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee and under the chairman's leadership to advance big and bold reforms. In recent years, we've seen both the Defense Business Board and a lot of think tank experts call for zero basing the defense acquisition system. This procedure would essentially hold that all acquisition regulations are guilty until proven innocent, that their benefits outweigh their costs. And I know you're still in the interim stages of your investigation. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how seriously you're looking at zero basing, and in your professional estimation, would such a wholesale change be practically possible?
I think anything's possible. It's do we have the will and commitment? And one of the things that happens as we dig through, you know, the federal, there's this belief by some that say, oh, you know, the department did that to themselves. Now, and what we're finding is there is a spectrum here. That's why we're chasing back every regulation, and it's very detailed, is where is the source? Where is the origin? And as you see in our supplemental on those little tiny examples, even those little examples, we had to go all the way back to a statute or an executive order to say, in order to change it in the regulation, this source document must also be changed. And so we're providing that information so that it actually can be acted upon. Some of our prior reports would say, go make this happen, but without the due diligence to make it happen, it's very difficult. So yes, we've talked about baselining. It is not only the Federal Acquisition Regulation. For the Department of Defense, it is also the 5000 regulation, which, as you know, again, is governing to our particularly major weapon systems acquisitions, but that is one of our findings. We seem to like to use that huge one-size-fits-all on everything, and that is part of the problem. We've discussed, no decisions made yet, but we've discussed that perhaps we have segmented buys, these, you know, where these long-term platforms do require a great deal of diligence, a great deal of commitment, but some of this other technology we should be doing like this. And when you apply the same process to that, neither one benefits appropriately.
I would just add to our chair's comment, to her credit, the chair, is that the way the panel's working is it's working simultaneously with the big concept ideas, the be bold part. But we know being bold and vague doesn't help too much. So while we're being bold at the concept level and reevaluating fundamental assumptions going back years, decades, we also have this team that our chairwoman said is actually going to prepare to go back and do line by line through the regulations to make the changes or recommendations and go back to the sources. So we give to you all that do that work for you. So it's the simultaneously, you have to really do both.
Mr. Congressman, I will preface this by saying we don't know the answer yet, but one of the areas of research is, do successful programs succeed because they're wonks, because they're experts in the FAR and how to get through the wickets, or are they just more courageous in their culture in using the freedoms that are allowed within an existing system? Which works best? And I think that'll inform the question of zero basing versus more freedom or more sea room.
Great. Well, by the time I ask my next question, you answer, I will have exceeded my time. So in deference to the chairman, I won't do that. I'd just say that maybe it's because I'm new and not yet jaded, but I think you have a lot of allies here when it comes to embracing bold reform. And so I encourage you to continue down that path, and hopefully we can muster up the willpower you referenced to be a partner in that. And so, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. It's incredibly important. I first want to make a comment. Mr. Dyer, I was very disturbed, but I heard before from a CEO the kind of statement that you made when they said, what is it about capitalism that you don't understand? And I was thinking, well, we wouldn't have capitalism if we didn't have this great democracy. And I'm wondering where, as I asked my friend who is a CEO, and I was talking to him about parts and outsourcing, et cetera, and the concerns, and he said, well, I have to answer to stockholders. And I said to him, well, do you have an Office of Patriotism? And so you touched on that. So how deep a problem is this? Have we, like, lost our sense that while the profit is very important, obviously, people need to have profit, have we lost our sense of also responsibility and the patriotism? I mean, you're standing here as patriots and saying, you know, we need to clean this up. And I agree with you, but I've had 6 years on this committee, and this is a fairly familiar conversation that we're having right now. So I just wanted to put that out there and see if anybody wanted to comment on that. Do we need to have a discussion, a revisit, a review of, you know, who we are and why we're doing this?
Well, it's an important question, but it's an issue of erosion of dominance and timing. I think American companies, high-tech companies, if they believe we are in a genuine extremis, if in a World War II kind of a situation, as Congressman Russell mentioned, I'm absolutely confident they will lay aside everything else and come to the support of the nation in a very patriotic sense. The problem, though, is the time constant of being prepared today for an erosion of dominance and the time we will have to harness that patriotism. Companies that are on their way to being publicly traded companies benefit by operating as a public company before they go there. We would benefit by operating as a warfighting acquisition community before we have to do it.
Congresswoman.
Go ahead. Well, I would also like to just mention one of the things in our report that is a sensitive subject is the balance of oversight. You notice that I use a term that makes everybody uncomfortable, which is we need to decriminalize commerce. We many times go into agreements expecting that there's something nefarious about a company who actually wants to be treated fairly, is concerned about their reputation, wants to make a fair product and profit. But yet, if they make one little mistake or they don't sign up, I mean, some recent decisions where every certification is subject to treble damages, companies sit back and say, wait, I don't know if I can do this because of the reputational risk and the very onerous application of remedy for something that might be, you know, that certainly is unintentional and may be monitored. So I think that's a contributor. And Charlie, I think
That's a fair comment, and maybe we need to have this discussion and bring in these companies and sit and talk about all of this and what the needs are in a different setting. And I have one last question. We're a procurement technical assistance program. I'm excited about these young new companies with their emerging technology, et cetera, but I know it's difficult. Are we utilizing this? Are they utilizing this enough? Are they aware of it? Are we making sure they're aware of it?
Congresswoman, we're looking exactly at that question. In fact, as we think about our small business issues and things of that nature, we want to understand just exactly what you're asking. So we've got a group of folks who are going to go out and spend some time with PTACs and understanding how much involved and what they're doing to connect small businesses to the department.
Right. So because safety and our security is a responsibility for all of us, and so thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and I yield back.
Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for the great work you're doing on behalf of our country. I wanted to share with you one of my concerns in the acquisition process. It starts when requirements are generated, and then we look through all the different ways to fill those requirements. And in many cases, there's a commercial service that could be purchased, but it only meets 95% of the requirements. And so since it doesn't meet 100% of the requirements, we end up immediately moving to a program where the government is purchasing, owning, and operating an entire system to meet really what is only 5% that commercial off-the-shelf can't provide as a service. And of course, that adds cost, complexity, time, effort, and challenges. And I see this especially in space-based communications. There's a lot of opportunity for us to lease capacity from commercial operators to change the way we do acquisitions of space-based communications. But you also see it, and I know Dr. LaPlante, you and I have talked in the past about avionics modernization in aircraft. And I'm not going to bring up the C-130 at all today, but I will tell you, you know, we see it when we need to do a modernization of a cockpit, and there are commercial off-the-shelf capabilities, and then there's this mil spec. And we have to meet a very specific military specification that, you know, has all these requirements for heat and vibration and all these hardened kind of capabilities. And then you look at the aircraft that this avionics modernization is going to go into, and it's a trainer, a T-1, for example, which is not going to be flying into combat at all. But we see these kind of programs where there's a 95% solution, and sometimes we add requirements that aren't necessary, and other times, if we just included commercial off-the-shelf in the process ahead of time, they could save us a ton of money and a ton of time, and they could do things. I know one of the things I advocate for is for the protected tactical waveform. But that's one example of a lot of different opportunities. If we can involve commercial off-the-shelf ahead of time, we can ultimately save time and money. And I'd like to hear your feedback on these things.
I'll start by saying I think you're hitting a key point. There's a type of analysis that's going to sound very bureaucratic called cost capability analysis. It's really monetizing requirements, basically saying, to your point about this is going to cost you to get 95%, to get to 100% is going to double the cost. Okay, do you really want to do that? That analysis, what I just monetize requirements, generally does not happen. If it does happen, it's not done robustly because we tend to have these serial processes where the requirements get finished, they get stamped, they get released, and then the acquisition people roll up their sleeves and start working. No, they should have gone back and forth on this monetization. The other piece, I think, which you would appreciate, it should be transparent. It should be public as best as possible, including the industry, how much these requirements are costing. Because then people will say, really? You're really going to double the cost of that just for that last 5%? And I think that piece is not done. And there are pilots being done around. We did one in the Air Force when I was there on EPAWS for F-15. I'd recommend you look at it. We had one lieutenant or captain in the Air Force. Probably saved us a ton of money by just going back to ACC and saying, look how much more this is costing for this requirement. And they said, oh, okay, never mind. So this is really important.
And in many cases, what you find in these programs where you're trying to finish that last 5%, we come to the end of the useful life of one satellite program. And now, in order to maintain that extra 5%, whether it's protection or some other kind of capability that's necessary for the military but not necessarily necessary for commercial, we enter into an entirely new military, government purchased, government-owned, government-operated system when it's not necessary. If we would just include commercial in what we were trying to accomplish to begin with. Some of the folks that I've talked to have described it as the tyranny of the program of record, where you finish one program of record and you go on to the next program of record without looking at what are all the options available to us. And I know that's what the analysis of alternatives kind of process is all about, but I don't think that always that's as utilized as it ought to be, as you articulated just now. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here and for the report, which, again, really is a serious analysis of the challenge that we face. I represent southeastern Connecticut, which a few years ago we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the launch of the Nautilus, and the story of Admiral Rickover, in terms of how he basically went around the Navy and the Pentagon to bring to fruition. It was a 5-year gap in time from the first light bulb that was powered by nuclear power to the launch of the Nautilus. Inside the Navy, they were telling him it would take 75 years before they would ever see a nuclear-powered vessel. And again, he actually went to Congress to find ways to get around the Pentagon sort of bureaucracy. And looking at the path forward at the end of your report in terms of just ideas that you're looking at in terms of thinking bold and moving forward, how can Congress sort of help with that? I mean, other than, obviously, I'm sure the chairman who's so passionate about this is going to do what he can to authorize, but, obviously that story, which is probably going to never be repeated again, maybe not, but, Congress really was a very big sort of player in terms of an advance that I think has really stood the test of time. I mean, our Navy still, I think, surpasses in terms of capability because of that incredible genius and determination, that took place 60-some plus years ago. So I don't know if you had any sort of comments about, ways this branch of government can sort of, kind of help sort of goose the process.
Yes, Congressman, I think your question speaks to as we put together a set of bold recommendations, how do we make sure that they are fully implemented to achieve the success that we collectively believe is important? And I think there's a series of things that have to go on. Obviously, within the department, there has to be some phenomenal change management activity established, and we have to inculcate this kind of thinking philosophically into our training programs. I think the Congress has to provide the sort of stick-to-itiveness from a sort of an independent perspective. I've even thought, there needs to be a continual, ongoing, independent authority that looks at, are we actually implementing the way that the Congress believes these kinds of recommendations should be implemented? Because typically what seems to happen is as we go through administrations and changes of cycles, people lose priorities and they refocus, and we start to get away from things that we collectively believed were important before we even put them in place and can understand whether or not they make a difference. So I think there are some efforts that can be put together to help us get down the road and make these things effective.
Congressman, there are similar stories today of tremendous success at great speed, but they're from Amazon and from Facebook and from Google. America knows how to do this. We just need to make it attractive to do it for the common good.
And I'd have to say, I just credit this committee and the chairman of this committee for your steady attention on this. It is making a big difference. It is. But it's a hard slog. It's a hard slog. The other thing I really commend doing, and I think this committee has done this over the years, stick to root cause. Treat the underlying disease, not the symptoms. That's one thing we're always asking ourselves. But again, I think to Admiral Dyer's point, you guys all know, you go out to the Valley and you sit down with Facebook, Google, and the companies, and you look at what they're doing, and you say, we can still do this stuff, it's just we got to be doing it in the government.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. Dr. LaPlante, I want to begin with you. I recently had a meeting with the CEO of one of the most successful defense contractors in the world, and I asked him, what goes into a successful contract? And he outlined 3 items: requirement stability, financial stability, and execution. And I wanted to get your perspective. Obviously, through the acquisition process in the Air Force, you've seen a lot through the years. Give me your perspective. What do we do to address the first item he points out, which is requirement stability? How do we push out requirement creep? And you've spoken a little bit about that, but I want to get a little more specific in your ideas about how that can happen.
Yeah, actually, I think my experience in the last 3 years when I was in the Pentagon, for the big weapon systems programs, I didn't see requirements creep. You know, the cliche is that the 4-star comes running in and pounds on your desk and say, oh, never mind, I don't want the fighter to do this, I want it to do that. That doesn't happen. In fact, if you look at the bomber, which is now called the B-21, those requirements, they were classified requirements mostly, were signed out by Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, in 2011, and they remained completely unchanged to this day. And that was really important for this industry, because what industry will tell you is finalize your requirements, get it to us early, don't change them, and give us stability and funding, and we'll execute to it. The only addition I would make, which is something that I'm still struggling with, I know our panel's struggling with, is the commercial companies that are moving fast don't pretend that they're going to know all the requirements when they start something fast.
Right.
So I think there's some activities with technology that you have to have a much more give and take on requirements as you build it, sort of the discussion we were just having with Congressman Bridenstine. But I think for the big weapons platforms, it's exactly right. What industry hates is they hate the fact that you're modifying the requirements a month before you drop the RFP. They say, wait a second, I can't invest. So that's really hard, and it takes discipline not to change requirements. In fact, in the tanker's a fixed price contract. My job and the job of the Air Force was never change the requirement, not once. And so far, they've managed to do that. So it's very important.
Is there more we can do up front with certain elements in the industry, in the RDT&E, to say, give us your thoughts and ideas about what we can accomplish? And obviously, within the Pentagon, there needs to be a baseline about what the needs are. But as Mr. Bridenstine spoke about, too, it's a matter of, you know, what can you do quickly and what can you do most cost effectively, not just in the acquisition process, but also the life cycle. And if you can take an off-the-shelf technology, many times, you know, value, life cycle cost, all are much, much better in that realm than something that is driven to 100% requirement.
Right. I believe very strongly that you have to do the kind of work that we were discussing with Congressman Bridenstine very early before you get to the big acquisition. You go back and forth and say, what can be done commercially? What can be done? Can we go back and forth? That has to be transparent, as I said, with industry. The interesting thing is in the Pentagon, you're discouraged from doing that because you're interacting with industry while you're forming the requirements.
Yeah.
And people used to ask me, well, isn't industry going to steer the requirements to their solution? So why, you know, I said, well, of course they're going to, but let's at least be transparent about it. Let them be an advocate for their solution. But that is all got to be done up front at the very beginning. And then once you're done, then you don't change the requirements.
I agree. Mr. Williams, let me ask a little bit different track question. Give me your perspective on the use of incremental funding, especially for larger programs where we expend dollars over a number of years and being able to leverage the most out of the dollars that we allocate in any one year. Give me your perspective on that.
It's absolutely critical. I mean, that gives us the funding flexibility that we need as we look across the years. I mean, this question of how we think about requirements and the changes that need to occur across the technology space as it goes forward requires that we are able to fund contracts based on the need as it exists and as it changes. We all too often get stuck in a requirement set, particularly in the high-tech community where things are changing rapidly, and the nature of the funding, the incremental approach, would be critical to allowing us to do that in a more flexible way.
Very good. Admiral Dyer, any thoughts about requirements creep or incremental funding?
I'm often asked, after having spent a long career in defense acquisition and then in my corporate world, what are the differences? You, I think, touch one of the primary differences that I observe, and that is the ability for commercial industry to sit down with suppliers, to have a discussion about what technology can bring to the need that the company has. And that's an intense dialogue that arrives at an understanding of requirements and contract much earlier and much faster than we do it in government. Why is it hard for us in government? I always suck wind through my teeth when I say this, but we are so worried about the appearance of fairness that sometimes we act not in the best interest of the nation.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chair Lee and fellow commissioners, thank you very much for your thoughtful report, interim report. We appreciate your dedication and hard work. And Madam Chair, led by Chairman Mac Thornberry, the House Armed Services Committee has been concerned about the cumbersome and time-consuming acquisition process that's hindered the department's ability to get innovative technology to the warfighter quickly enough to make a difference. In your view, is the department competitive in getting the best technology to the warfighter in the theater? And do you have any recommendations to expedite?
That certainly is a thrust of our report. My concern, as we've heard from many of the members here, is we do have a very powerful military. We don't want to in any way, shape, or form belittle what's been accomplished. But what we're saying is the environment has changed so substantially that that era and that approach needs to be modernized to address the emerging and changing threat and the changing dynamic marketplace. I think time is critical, and we've got to figure out a way to do these things much more quickly.
And I wish you well, because in my National Guard service, we worked with communications, the SINGAR system, and it certainly occurred to me, as even as a JAG officer, that we could do better, and with more advanced technology. And so look forward to your recommendations, particularly on communications. And Secretary LaPlante, the report indicated the growing and changing global defense marketplace, where companies are no longer dependent on the Department of Defense for contracts, and parts from major systems are sometimes built all over the world. Specifically, the report references the F-35 is produced in part by 8 foreign nations. What is your view, that all components should be manufactured in the United States, or is multinational manufacturing helpful while securing our technological advantage? And keeping in mind, too, that the F-35 multinational manufacturer creates a international market.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it was just the other day that the first F-35 was built in Italy, was just rolled out, if I remember right. And it's going to be produced, I believe, also in Japan. So yeah, the international aspect of the F-35 program is a huge strength of the program, frankly. It's a huge strength for multiple reasons. One is we want our allies and partners to be buying the airplane, because it's the best airplane in the world for that kind of plane, and we're going to fight with them. We certainly don't want them to go to other people. The Chinese, I was going to the air shows. I know some of you go to these air shows. Was at the last one I went to as Assistant Secretary was Dubai. The Chinese push of their military equipment there was very strong. They had their replica of the F-35, the J-31. They had their version of the MQ-9. So it's very clear we don't want other countries to buy their stuff. We want them to buy the F-35. So it's a strength of the F-35. The question that you're getting at, which is the risk equation, which is the supply chain risk, and do we have an understanding of the supply chain and its global origins? I think where technology is going, without getting too technical here, the idea of having a root of trust in, for example, our hardware, regardless of where it is developed, is something that we as technologists have to give everybody, because we're at a point even in cellular communications, just in this country, where the root of trust of the cellular communications may be produced in China. So it's a much bigger issue than just with the military. And I think the technical solution to it is understand the supply chain, understand how the root of trust is ensured, meaning how do we understand the sanctity of what has been done or not to that supply chain. That is not easy. But I think the answer of pulling everything back in and not having F-35s produced globally is not the right answer.
And I appreciate particularly the concern of security, of maintaining that indeed what's produced is not copied by some other country that might come to mind. And for Commissioners Williams and Dyer, your interim report indicates the DoD acts if it can dictate terms to the industry, driving many companies not to be part of the defense market. Can you elaborate on what DoD can do to change this pattern?
Yes, I think we have to look particularly at the oversight structure that's involved in managing and supporting contracts. The whole issue of compliance centered around audit requirements and pricing and things of that nature is robust opportunity, because when you think about the time frame that it takes and the amount of resources that industry has to bring to bear to meet those compliance requirements, it often keeps them from wanting to do business or giving them the ability to do business with the department. That's one of the things we hear consistently as we talk to companies out there who want to do business but have chosen not to.
Thank you very much.
Congressman Wilson, I should mention, especially for you, sir, that the panel is well led. And as you may or may not know, our chairperson, Ms. Lee, is from South Carolina. So I just wanted to point that out.
That should have been brought up first. I can't believe it. I always count on the chairman to bring up important issues. Thank you very much.
Sir, in answer to your question, we have to facilitate a conversation between high-tech, non-traditional industry and DOD. You and I recently have discussed the role that consortia may be able to provide in terms of bringing in refreshed R&D to expand the base and to find those kinds of successes that we see at Amazon, Google, et cetera, and bring them back into DOD.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. In today's economy, the pace of technological advancements is growing exponentially. And in the interim report, you write, quote, "The acquisition process must be agile enough to respond to rapidly evolving threats and fast enough to develop and deliver new capabilities within the arc of emerging threats." And my particular interest is in the area of the cyber domain. Could you discuss the reform measures you have identified that better achieve this agile system to respond to emerging threats specifically in the cyber domain?
I don't know if the commission has weighed in yet on cyber. I'll give you some of my own views that are not, the commission hasn't done it, but the others can chime in. I think let's talk about what makes it hard for somebody who's trying to do damage to you with cyber. What makes it hard for them? A couple things. One, if you're changing all the time, if I'm putting out hundreds of versions of Google every 2 days or Facebook, whatever, for whatever reason I'm doing it, that's got to be hard on an attacker, number one. The other is heterogeneity, meaning things are different. We tend to, for economies of scale, make things the same. I think those two design principles, speed, which is already happening anyway in the commercial world, constant development, constant change, constant pushing, literally software pushed out overnight, and then look at the design and heterogeneity. I think those key aspects of design will keep us ahead in cyber, because the benefits we get from the Facebooks and the Googles and our mobile apps is great for society. It brings with it risks, but we have to manage it into our system. And so I think that's the key point for cyber.
And I think what we'll also see in our report, there's a mismatch between that ability to constantly change when we want to, well-meaning, have this process where it's full and open, everybody can propose. That takes time and really impacts the ability to be flexible and make those changes. So we're asking ourselves, not specifically from cyber, although we have looked at from a technology standpoint, is there a better way to have a competitive underpinning, but a much more flexible response?
That's part of another activity. I've been looking at this, and just to add to that, I think it's Google says that they change half their software every month. Now, what change means, maybe small change, big change. Cars are pushing software out overnight, okay? So the idea that we could move into a system, can you imagine pushing out continuously software globally to the F-35 mission systems? People shudder at that. On the other hand, for lots of reasons, including security, that may be where we need to go. That certainly is where the commercial world is going.
Just to follow up, Dr. LaPlante, you talked about how, and Ms. Lee, you spoke about how you're not specifically looking at cyber, or haven't yet, as part of, it wasn't included in this interim report. I think that's really important. In my capacity as chairwoman of the Emerging Threats Subcommittee, Cyber Command falls under our jurisdiction, and acquisition reforms, we need to look critically on what our proposals are and how they would impact cyber, because, as I said, the pace of development is much more rapid, and we need to ensure that we're investing in our cyber readiness and our cyber defenses. So a year from now, I'm hopeful that you can have a specific response related to cyber. Any comments? I'd like to get your feedback on that.
We'll certainly put it on our list here and see how to best go about that.
Okay, thank you,
Look
Ms.
forward
Lee.
to working with you on it.
I would also commend, there's some great work that's being done by the Defense Science Board on cyber, and I would also get this committee to look at that, including the resiliency of our weapon systems and all these issues. Whether this panel gets to it, I leave it to our chair, but we appreciate the concern. It's obviously cyber is at the top of all of our minds.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this great report. But it's really on us collectively to do something about it. I guess, as I look at the threats, powerful nations with economies that have a totalitarian type of system, they can streamline acquisition very quickly. The only way we will be able to leverage and stay ahead is through our innovation. And yet, we've seen 300, by your own report, 300 primes now reduced to 5 mega primes. We see an archaic system where small businesses really aren't small anymore, leveraging our rules, where they're $2 to $3 billion company and they're still taking small business incentives. I haven't figured out how they do that. And as I look at the funding of concepts with no real delivery, you have small companies out there that are doing incredible innovation, but a mega prime will step in and, well, for $200 million, we'll come up with a concept and a plan, and we'll get back to you. And often those dollars will get siphoned off. Mid-sized companies, the few that remain, are investing their own venture capital, and they're putting their investment and innovation in. And then when they come to the table with fantastic ways to leverage the future, we have the simplified acquisition program, which is no longer simplified, and then our FARs. My own thinking is we need to throw out all of the FARs. Just throw them all out and then make the case for which ones need to go back in instead of the other way around. And I think we might be better served. But with regard to incentives, I was caught in your report where you say without changing this mentality of incentives, we will never have reform occur. And I agree with that. And on that note, the Defense Innovation Unit experimental, that is something that we've seen some amazing things happen from. I think of these innovative smaller companies that gave us the Predator, the LCAS system. I mean, things that are totally changing in how we fight and deal with future threats. Would y'all speak to the DIUX program? Because there's been kind of it's been vogue to try to want to crush that, and I would like your opinion on that.
I'll just say a few words about it. I don't know if the panel is, or the commission's looking specifically at DIUX. What the commission is looking at, which will hopefully answer your question, is things that the DIUX is trying. And so anybody who's trying the following, we commend them because it's experimentation. What they're doing is they're trying things like other transactional authority. Remember earlier we were talking about how hard it is to do contracting?
Right.
Well, the DIUXs, both out in California and in Boston, and maybe the other one too, is trying to get people on contracts sometimes within weeks, and using the authorities that they have. And just by doing that alone, they're providing a huge value and learning the lessons for it. So I would commend any activity, and I think the committee would, any activity that the department has that is trying these experiments of using existing authorities to do things differently or faster. I can turn over to my colleagues for other comments.
Congressman, we've spoken to DIUX a little bit, and they're doing some tremendous things, and they're taking advantage of authorities that exist to allow them to move fast. OTs are one example. The question that I think is important for all of us is why aren't we able to do that in other parts of the department? Why do you have to have these sort of specialized groups to do that? And I think that's the root question here, because obviously one organization is limited in its capabilities and what it can do, and we need to think that through. I think DIUX working with the services, obtain funding to go acquire things that the services need, but you have to ask yourself, why do the services need to turn it over to DIUX? Why aren't they able to do that themselves?
Yeah,
think that's
I couldn't agree more. And I think, when we have national emergency, we see things like the Rapid Fielding Initiative, DIUX, these different programs that meet the emergency, where industry, as you've all commented on, in leveraging their off-the-shelf technologies, and it's like, well, okay, how could we harden that? Or better yet, how could we adapt our systems? And the warriors out there in the field, they figure out how to do that stuff all the time. And I guess, I'm heartened to hear you say that, and I would hope, Mr. Chairman, that as we look into the future on contracting reform, we don't kill the nascent systems that really help us get to that. And then I am very interested, Ms. Lee, in some of these FAR eliminations, and I hope you will let us reach out to your office because we will have an axe in hand and drop amendments. So I hope to be contacting you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We look forward to that. Thank you.
Ms. Lee, we really hadn't talked about timing. I mentioned at the beginning that through no fault of the commission, y'all kind of got off to a slow start. What are you looking at now?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for acknowledging that. We did get a slow start, and we very much appreciate the 2017 NDAA where you clarified that we are an independent panel and that, in fact, the panel had the authority to use 5 U.S.C. 3161, which we needed in order to hire our staff and also to accept industry volunteers or volunteers. So that has been very fruitful. However, even though we were sworn in August of 2016, we couldn't hire any of our small staff until December of 2016. And so we got internet in March and had quite a celebration over that. So that's a very long way of saying we'd like to have 2 full years to do our work. And so with a start in about the January timeframe, we would like very much to go to January of 2019 to give our report. I think that aligns with your calendar. We are discussing some possibility of some interim supplemental reports. And then the other thing would be however long you would want us to be available after that to take your actions and to do additional work.
Well, we certainly want to work with you on it. Obviously, we want to take advantage of this gathering of expertise that you have assembled on the commission. At the same time, I think we feel the same sense of urgency that y'all have so eloquently expressed here today. So you want to get it right, but you also want to push out boldly. And so we want to work with you on timing. And my personal opinion is that maybe some interim reports help because that gives us some meat to work with while you continue to work on the other items.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'd also really I'd like to acknowledge the Army has been very helpful, forthcoming with detailees and help. We're working with the other services, and we're also working a little on the budget challenge. So those are the challenges that remain before us.
Well, I'll just say in general that I am incredibly encouraged by the last 2 hours. I've heard the same things that y'all have referenced, that, oh, just another study on acquisition, everybody's tried, you're beating your head against the wall. Number one, I don't think any of us can accept what we have today because we know we can't defend the country that way. But secondly, I'm really impressed. Each of you bring particular expertise based on your experience in various places in the system, and you feel that urgency and can bring your expertise to bear with an urgency to get it fixed. So, I know we will never have a perfect system. But on the other hand, I am very encouraged, and you could tell from the questions on both sides of the aisle, there are members of this committee that are just as determined as y'all are to work to make this better. And I think together, with your work product, our continued efforts, we definitely can. And so I want to thank you for what you've done so far, being here for today, the interim report, and especially for the work that you're going to do in the future. Hearing stands adjourned.